let's discuss the Allfather. Svan, where do you think is a good place to start a discussion about Odin?
Ooh, that's a big, broad chunk of a lot of things. I think first and foremost, we should talk about how the nature of divinity amongst the Asatru Folk Assembly. I think that it's important for us to establish first and foremost that when we talk about the gods, we're not talking about the gods as some sort of a profile. We're not uh, digging through bits of lore with the intentions of fitting them into things that we need to fit. That we hold first and foremost gift cycle, and that we see the divine as truly living and willful, uh, moving and dynamic, especially the Allfather. So, establishing that and making sure that people understand that when we talk about the lore and we talk about things that we read, and when we look at comparative things, whether it's, Pan-Germanicism, Pan-Aryanism, specifically, or even Pan-Nordicism, if we're talking about uh, the differences between, say, like the Prose Eddas and the sagas, or like when we paint pictures of um, Odin in Grimnismaul versus like the Volsunga sagas and the way that he's perceived. Uh, Sometimes we have to understand that these stories are meta narratives, but also narratives still, and with an intended audience and with an intended purpose to speak the stories and to portray things. So I think that first and foremost, seeing the gods, firstly with how we have interacted with the gods is most important, and then moving into lore and things like that. And of course, right now, I'm a big believer right now that that Odin is on the wild hunt right now. So I'm a big believer on the idea that at the equinox begins the starting of the wild hunt, and it doesn't end until towards Yuletide, or I would say, if you're Anglo-Saxon or Theod, if you're doing only 3 days, they might consider it at Yule, but it's generally right around the full moon or in the middle of Yule that I view the wild hunt ends. So it's very auspicious. I think we had a very auspicious moment that happened at Winter Nights, and so seeing the gods as living, real, willful, dynamic, and all-encompassing of their abilities to move in and out and above and through weird itself, is first and foremost. And then we move into other things like where does Wodenaz as a name come from? Where does it come from for our people, and what does it establish? And I think that it's pretty much well agreed upon that Woth or Voth, and most likely it would be Woth with a W. The V sound seems to be a later addition or a transition in the 10th century to 12th century in Europe, especially in Germany. But Woth seems to have a root towards fury and the idea of furious mental state, furious, maybe even a climate state, or even a state of psychosis within certain situations, whether it's in poetic or singing of runic songs, or being in battle and experiencing that kind of sense of fury and inspiration and or confusion mixed in the two. I think a kind of a moment of clarity, so focused that everything else seems to disappear. So you become, or I shouldn't say confusion, but maybe unawareness of the big picture and a hyper focus on the moment or the central focus of time. And it seems to be that from expanding from that, we have the idea of consciousness in humans within the folk, as he is the god of hyper consciousness. So when we talk about Woth in that hyperconscious state, we're referring to that deep focus. Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about Wodenaz, there's differences in the possibility at the end there. I know that Woth obviously seems to be connected to fury and inspiration. It survives in Old Norse as Other, or Other, and it that means furiousness. If you see somebody who's Other, like in Icelandic, it's like somebody with a fist and they're hyper ready to go. And, you know, there's a sense of caution to the word too. So, I mean, this could relegate to the idea of both hyper focus and hyper consciousness on memorizing poetic, singing rune songs, or also all the way down and into the berserker or the Ulfhidner and their preparations for battle, or the battle itself. So I think that part is covered when we think of Woth, but the Anaz part too is interesting. There's been some theories as to like whether the AS or AZ. Most likely, the farthest that I can go back is the AS, like suffix of the Goths, the Gutens. Excuse me, the Gutens were more. They often put an AS at the end, so. Correlating the differences between masculine and feminine seem to be correlated in that, and also to the idea that people have proposed that the as or as at the end is kind of where we get the word aus in the late Nordic period. So Wothen aus or Woth aus, kind of being led to that as the furious divine one. So, I mean, name structure, I think, is important, because we understand and begin to relate to him through our language first and foremost. And when we start this, we have our branch, the Germanic branch, and we need to try to understand everything about it in correlation to him through our language. I think that's important. I think that's one of his highest functions. So when we talk about sounds and we talk about runes or the symbols of sounds, language is probably the first place to start with trying to build relationship with him.
All right, so let's pause for a second. I think it was a very good idea to start with our understanding of what a god is and what a god isn't. And I think is a really good second step is understanding the name and the implications of the name. But on that first step, I'm trying to think of the best way to start it. With so much of the conversation tonight, it's difficult to know where to start. And I think that's an issue with House of Truths of Faith in general. It's so all-encompassing that it's hard to pick a good starting point and work from it. As far as what the gods are, they are the source of our existence. And in that sense, they are our most ancient of ancestors. But what I think is fundamental to our practice is that the gods are beings. They exist. They have personality. They have will. They have emotion. They have the things that make a person have personness. And the fundamental on that isn't the silliness of needing Sky Daddy. The fundamental of that is the participation in a gift cycle. And the gift cycle is the very root of our ritual structure, be it within our social group, be it involving our ancestors, and ultimately, and perhaps most profoundly, in our relationship with the gods. In order for, if the gods were just some kind of psychic function or archetype or something devoid of personality, then the gift cycle lacks meaning. And at that point, it becomes a science project. When we're dealing with beings and persons who have personality, then the gift cycle is fundamentalism and is everything. Building bonds through relationship, through devotion, through making offerings, and through receiving offerings and blessings is at its very core what Aryan faith is and what it's about. And so that the discussion is, we don't have a point to discuss unless we can establish that fundamental, that the perspective we are coming from is that our gods are real and exist, and they exist as persons with personality and with will. And I think that's extremely important. And I just wanted to make sure we hammer that home a little bit before we get a little deeper into what Odin's name is and what that means. Svan, in the most simple breakdown, how would you explain what the name Odin translates to?
I would say it translates to fury projected into mankind, his consciousness, his soul, and the willful manifestation of action and fury within the cosmos. Seeing the dynamicism of Woden leads me to believe that function, that root word Woth, is what he greatly represents as he functions through these. Whether we're looking at stories, whether we're looking at personal events, things that people have had happen to them, or their workings with certain things, I would say would always kind of denote that there is a sense of fury. But the fury isn't necessarily something I would say. It would be akin to the furious motion of falling suddenly, the kind of this quick and absolute rush of power, whether it's internally in the mind or whether it's externally as he moves and does things.
I think it's fundamental when we're talking about this that folks, we run into this a lot, that language, and certainly language as it's come down to us today, lacks some of the depth and breadth required to express metaphysical or deeply spiritual things. In this context, for everybody listening, fury is synonymous with ecstasy, is synonymous with overwhelming inspiration. Everything that Svan said is absolutely correct. When asked myself to translate, I take Odin's name to mean the master of inspiration, or the master of the fury, the master of that ecstasy. And I think that points to the will that Svan talked about, the will to fury. So when I talk about mastery implies command of or willful execution of. And so I think those are fundamentals in understanding the All-Father, and in starting on the right page of that understanding.
And it seems that the ecstasy seems to also correlate to the idea of speed. That may be why it means furious. Furiousness is a suddenness, a great and overwhelming quickness of a sudden inspiration or a sudden realization of action that needs to be done. And that correlates pretty clearly with Odin's aspect as the chooser of the slain. When we're talking about these moments of battle, that would really, the sudden and quickness of things, how things happen. But it applies, I think, more so to, yes, consciousness and that suddenness. And there's a certain denotion of speed. So I think that's why fury, it does get misconstrued, but it also fits. It's ecstatically fast moment of either a mental or physical initiation or inspiration / willful manifest to do something, all coalescing in perfect timing. It's kind of hard to explain that, but to say like the furious God, people could take that in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of lore that would suggest fury just as in the power and anger of fury, as it denotes in our language, could apply, but it's deeper than that.
All right. Well, and so I assume that most of our audience has a familiarity with Odin already. So I don't think that any of these shows that we do on our gods are going to be comprehensive, but they're a good starting point to see where the audience is going to take us and what questions might come. Sarah asks, Odin has many different names. Can you speak on this and what perhaps the reason is for that? Do you have ideas on that, Svan?
Oh, absolutely. First and foremost, when we're talking about the late Nordic period, we have to remember that the skalds, the Skjolds of the Anglo-Saxons and the skalds of the late Nordic period, it's worth noting that I think the biggest and most pivotal thing for them was the understanding of the divine inspiration that was given from Odin through Kvasir's blood. And so when you have that connective point, and it is seen culturally that when they're speaking in a divine sense, that the higher and the better that they speak, they have this power over the audience. They have this kind of pinnacle sense, and they are more than just mere entertainment in the hall. It's pretty well understood that not only are they pulling from lore, but they're also committing to memory these names. So I'm not saying that the Skalds created the names entirely, maybe some of them for sure, but they commit them to memory with great reason, because in a lot of ways their poetic sense was a devotional act in and of itself. And so having the committed memory of all of the Heiti of Odin is, I think, incentive. They have motive. And in a lot of things, I've even heard of people committing to like saying all of the Heiti as a meditative form of like almost like a mantra in which they recite out the names of and all the names and Heiti of Odin. So, and you can see this in the Skaldrapismal, where they talk about the different names of the gods, but and clearly, and in Grimnismal, where they talk about Odin in specifics having multiple Heitis, the multiple names, and all of them alluding to different functions, whether it's Oski, which means the wish, or the word wish, or to give of wishes, or even Yggr, YGGR, where we get Yggdrasil, it's terrible, or Bolverk, bale worker. All of these names seem to have both syncretic function in the story, or they're listed and they're committed to memory because the Skalds are devoting their mental space to memorizing these Heiti and showing the different aspects, and knowing how high he had a place within the poetic circles. It would give reason as to why they were known more than, say, perhaps other Heitis. So when you look at names like Odin's high in poetry, but not high in names. Thor is high in names. When you see the folk, they name their children Thorstein or Thorbjorn, or something of that nature. There's a lot of usage of Thor in children's names, but there isn't a lot in Odin's name. And perhaps maybe they make allusions to other Heitis, but the only one that comes to my mind right off the bat is Odindis, which was a woman's name, and saying she's a maiden of Odin. It's not used a lot. So we can look at poetic names, physical names, and place names, and I think that's important. There's a lot of place names dedicated to Odin that would show application and popularity, perhaps in the Old Norse. But the reason why it's crystal clear in the poetics is because the Skalds are one of the top tier devotional folks of Odin, the followers. I think they were the premier cult of Odin at their time. And there may have been other cults of Odin previously. And when we talk about like hound cults or wolf cults and things like that, or battle cults, and we could go into that. But we know at the time, especially with later Nordic periods and the things that Snorri was pulling from, it was the Skalds that were probably the last and final true strong cult of the god of the of any of the gods of the folk.
I think that when we deal with the names of our gods, when we deal with the imagery that attends our gods, and when we deal with all of the other names our gods are known by, that's very much a story of the relationship of our folk to our divinity and what that looks like. Words are all about communication and what that evokes. And over the lifespan of the Aryan race of man, our people have encountered Odin in a myriad ways at different points in their life in different circumstances. It's one of the things when Svan was talking to us a little bit about the name that was implied in it was the dynamicism, was all of the diverse facets that make up this just amazing and mysterious and fascinating God. He is each of those things, and he is all of those things. And he shows one face to his friends and one face to his foes. I would further posit that at no point in time did he appear in the flesh before, ancient haplogroup ancestor of ours and say, "Hi, my name's Odin." I think that us referring to that God by that name is part of that process of how we know him and what we know of him. And so I think that says a lot about the relationship our ancestors had with him and the role he played in their life and in their cultures. It's kind of random. I don't know if it really relates to the question, but one of the things that I think is a particularly profound aspect of our relationship with Odin is that he is the God of kings. And we have other gods that in different parts of Europe serve a similar function, but I would say more royal houses than any other trace that lineage back to Odin as the sire of that line, and do so even well into Christian times. Very late, the kings of Spain would trace their lineage back to Odin. For all I know, the current House of Spain might as well. I'm not sure, but it's really surprising at the breadth of that and how long that lineage kept on even after our gods, the worship of our gods, has fallen out of fashion. So I think that's worth mentioning. Brandy says, have either the Alsheriogothi or Whit and Harrell ever had a personal experience with Odin in bloat or personal circumstance that they would be willing to share? Svan, step up to the plate. What do you got for us?
Oh, a personal experience. Okay. This one is kind of hard for me in the sense that I've always brought a sense of trying to logically reckon the situation I'm in. It's a habit. It's sometimes a bad habit, I think, because it doesn't allow me to open up fully. I've had a couple of experiences in runic things, receiving auspices during runic things like that. I think that also to having a visual I've had one moment of a visual something. I was very young, and I was scared half to death of something standing across a lake from me, that was very tall and dark shadowed and just clearly made of cloth or something moving across the way, but there was nothing over there. There would be no reason for anything man-made to be over there, and there wasn't there when the light was on, like the sunlight and everything was out. Suddenly there was this um, presence. But I can say both through a dream and also an interesting thing that happened quite recently. Firstly, through the dream, when I was I was young as a teenager, mid-teens, 16, 17. I had a dream in which I can remember quite vividly. I was little in the dream. I was a young child, and I remember because I looked down upon myself and saw a shirt that I had worn when I was little. And I mean, perhaps that's a echo of the time looking down at that shirt when I was a child, but in the dream it was pretty clear, and that's what indicated to me that I was a child. And I was standing upon a road, and the road was enclosed with branches that kind of formed almost like a roof along the road, and I couldn't see the end of the road. And suddenly, as soon as I kind of began to digest that I was a child and that I was standing on this road, then I understood that there was a presence next to me. And I saw a hand, an older or an elder hand. And I remember it very clear. And as I looked up, I couldn't make out a face. And just the sense of like an older, wise, very powerful presence. And there was a voice, and the voice said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes." And then I was kind of urged to walk the road. It was kind of like a hand grabbing my hand and just going to move down the road. Wasn't walking with me. It was just kind of an initiation of it. Like, okay, begin. And then I woke up from that. And that was one dream. And then recently I held bloat to Odin, and this is a more roundabout because there's no direct presence, but I was asking Odin that if I am to go in a direction, if I am on this road, and I reference this dream often when I talk to Odin in prayer, if I'm on the correct path, if I could get some kind of lending of the idea of whether I'm going in a wrong direction or a right direction, confirmation, if you will, anything. And I left myself open for it, and I wasn't demanding anything. And so I left my shop, and in the parking lot in the middle of the summer, and the wind is out, and all of these things, I find 3 black feathers in the parking lot. And I thought that was pretty interesting, and I didn't quite get to the blow time. I just, there's these feathers, and I picked them up, and they were all from the same bird. And I didn't fully know, but I have a website that I go to identify feathers, and I looked it up, and it seems to the crow, American crow, or corvid. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. 3, and they're in the middle of the parking lot. They're right next to my car. But the story got even deeper than that. I was visited by my wife earlier that day, and she had a story of her own when I showed up with these 3 feathers. She was the one that threw those feathers into the parking lot, and that's because she was house sitting for a dear friend of hers, and she's a naturalist, and she has an actual crow's nest in her backyard along a waterway in the Chesapeake Bay. And this crow had taken residence there and was known to, groom himself or herself and drop feathers. And when she was talking on the phone with this woman, the woman said, yeah, if you find any feathers, you can give them to Svan, and maybe he'll like them. So she went out there and she picked up 3 feathers that she never expounded on whether there were any more or if these were just the best looking ones, but she picked up 3 feathers, and then she left from the house sitting, and suddenly there was a series of kind of or unfortunate events, not to my wife, but surrounding people that she knew. There was, a fatality had happened. There was all of these things kind of hitting her communication wise, where she was finding out a series of kind of strange events. And suddenly it kind of hit her by the time she got to my shop that maybe I shouldn't give these to Sman. Maybe there's some sort of correlation of like an ill omen. And so she had picked up the 3 feathers and threw them out into the parking lot, aiming for the grass and hoping that the wind would just kind of scatter them and let them go. But they didn't. They were right next to the driver's side of my car. And when she told me this and how they came to be there and how they were absolutely crow feathers and she had come across them, and of course the number 3 being very significant for me in correlation to Odin, I took this as an auspicious sign that I had been in the right direction. I don't know if the feathers correlated to the ill omens that she received, but the feeling was there for her, and she kind of just let them go, but they found me anyways. So
yeah, I appreciate you sharing those with us. There's a reluctance oftentimes to share spiritual experiences. And I want folks to understand that if you encounter that in the AFA, it's not due to a lack of experiences or due to, the AFA doesn't do that kind of stuff. It's much more an issue of reverence and a fear of being impious. We don't want to ever be overly casual about those things. And we're very careful, or we try to be, not to unjustifiably put words into the mouth of the gods and take liberties in that way. Especially our Gothar who have responsibilities in that regard and who are listened to. We don't want to misuse that spot to, we don't want to ever use the gods as a tool to legitimize things. So we want to be very careful with that. I have had numerous pretty powerful experiences, I feel, in bloat to Odin. There are a lot of subtle things, a lot of animal sign, bird sign and whatnot. A lot of things that way. A couple of recent things, and then kind of my little bit bigger deal one. A number of bloats I've done at Odenshof. I believe all to Odin, when this has occurred, have had a blue energy that's only captured on people's cameras from lots of different cameras at different moments that is around me and amongst me and interacting with me during the bloat. I don't know what that is. I don't know any of the number of things that might debunk that, but it seems very significant in its timing and in what it's doing during those times. And I take that to be really significant. This last charming of the plow in Washington, we're doing it at a rented camp. So it wasn't, there was no permanent worship space there. So we had to find a flat spot that was kind of in a rough parking lot area, and it was icy, and we go out there and the wind's howling and whipping around and stuff's going on. And so we proceed to start Odin bloat. And right as I start the bloat, I'm looking around and realizing the need for a tine to asperge with and an evergreen sprig to asperge with. A gust of wind picks up and rips off the perfect size sprig of evergreen that floats down and lands right at my feet at that moment. And it felt very significant to me. And I think other people in the circle had a reaction to that as well. And then the most profound experience like that, weird in the appropriate use of the term, experience like that I had was at Ostara 2017. I officially became the Alsheri-Gothi of the Asatru Folk Assembly at midsummer of 2016, but unofficially, my time leading our church started around Ostara of 2016. And a lot of that was behind the scenes things to structure a smooth transition when it was time. But that's when I really took the reins of things. And I was under a lot of pressure at that time. And I don't say that for pity or for sympathy. You know, that pressure was because I'm literally the most fortunate man in the entire world and the most blessed man in the entire world. So I don't begrudge any of that, but it was still a lot of pressure. It was a lot of responsibility. And I was at a moment in time where there was very real fear and concern that with that transition, the AFA might crumble. That all of this that I think at that point, 21 years were put into it, it could all come crashing down if I didn't do the right things, or if I, made one false move and the whole thing might collapse. And so I was feeling a lot of that weight and a lot of that responsibility. And I was trying with every ounce of myself to do the right thing, to keep this up, to be worthy of the gods, worthy of leading our folk, just not to screw anything up and to do the right things. And so this is marking the kind of complete year cycle of this that I was going through. And, numerous people were there that were very close to me that I felt supported me on this. I had, as a matter of fact, I just got done getting a haircut from Svan here. And I walked out to the circle and people were ready for us to do Sambal. And so I was, collecting myself and getting my thoughts together, and I was standing up to bless the horn, and someone put their hand on my shoulder. And, I think we're familiar with that feeling of somebody putting their hand on your shoulder and like just kind of reassuring squeeze, shake your shoulder. You got this. And it was really well timed. And it meant a lot to me. And at the time I'd assumed it was Alan, and I turned around and was going to, give him a nod and thank him for that, because it was a really, really appreciated gesture. But there was nobody in arm's reach of me. There was nobody anywhere close to behind me. At that moment, and to this day, it is my sincere belief that that was the hand of the Allfather. I don't mean it was like a hand was on my shoulder, or it felt like a hand was on my shoulder, or I sensed with every fiber of my being a hand was on my shoulder. I felt every bit of it, just like, like I said, I'd assumed it was Alan. But to this day, I believe that was the Allfather, and I feel very, very blessed for that experience. King of Cheese, Matt Svan, I've heard that Odin is the sort of god you don't want the attention of, that having him actually focus on you is disastrous. How true do you think that is? What are your thoughts, Svan?
Well, that definitely has merit. If we're talking about the lore, if we're talking about the sagas, and we're talking about our ancestors and the way that they portrayed, especially in the late Nordic period, their relationship with Odin, it most certainly held a dangerous element, if you will. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this. And I was looking at the question earlier, and I was kind of rifling through my notes. There's a lot of examples of this, and I think it comes from, first and foremost, it is Odin who is the swiftest to claim the price of his blessings. And that's a really important thing to focus on. The blessings are given, the blessings are received, but oftentimes, if there is a reclamation, it is swift. And again, we bring back to fury, we bring back to the suddenness of dynamicism and movement in his name. So wouldn't be far off to understand that swiftness could be easily directed at us or of that nature. And so that can be a bit terrifying. And there is a lot of accounts in which that is, said, even in the Havamal. In the Havamal, in 110, I know that Odin swore a ring oath, but who can trust his troth? He swindled Suttungur and took Sumblemead from him and left Gunnlöth to weep. So there is a sense of the idea that there is a price oftentimes associated. Again, Sigurd's father, and in the time of his reclamation, in which it's in the story is said that he sees Odin on the battlefield, and he attempts to block him, and it shatters his sword, and then he is taken, and it takes a while for him to die, because he does have a conversation with his wife in order to set the next part of the legacy with Sigurd. There's also King Vikar and his mother, Gerhildur. He says to her, that I want what's in between your Bernie, your armor, and your body. And it was kind of alluded to the idea that he wanted her dress, but that was not the case. She was full with child, and so he wanted her child. And there's an air of kind of mystery and there's that sense of fear in relation to, I think, Odin when we talk about his attentions. For the longest time, I know people that, especially in early Asatru, the idea was not to place a Valknot on your body with reckless abandon, but that it would, in essence, bind you or fetter you to the machinations of what Odin had in store for the folk in order to stave off the doom of the gods and the doom of the folk. So this put you in a precarious situation, and there had to be a precept that you were willing to give yourself up to that. And so, there's a lot of people that have talked about the Valknot not having the significance that we place upon it, but the symbols and the significance have absolute validity within the time frame that they're used, and so I take that as a high mark. So, seeing how the Christians dealt with Odin amongst the folk and demonizing him, and even kind of in the transitionary stages between the elder and the foreign faith that was coming from Rome, and ultimately beyond that, they greatly kind of extended the concept that he was a god of ill omen and was not to be spoken of. I have met many Theodish practitioners who don't speak of him openly. And again, this has connections to the idea of Hammingja and of our connections to luck and to weird, and I think ultimately to our fate or our dooms, and the judgment of his ability to call on that price. And so that air of mystery there, I think, is important as a a dynamicism of our relationship with him is that the reclamation can be swift. And oftentimes when we see his machinations, we wonder the goodness in them because we can only see the emotional investment of the moment without seeing the grand picture, which is what makes Odin so powerful, is that his perspective is from the grand to the micro, and we are often of the micro and missing the grand. So as far as understanding too that he's not always seen as a boogeyman, that he's oftentimes seen, and it is worth noting, joyous, the wish giver, and is happy with the folk and the gods when they attain things and speak gloriousness of the gods and of the folk, or attain deeds. So not entirely, but it is certainly there, in my opinion of it all.
So I think this approaches another fundamental that's really important for us to understand when talking about our gods and our relationship to them. And that's what counts and what doesn't in a authoritative sense. As I said earlier, our lore is a story of our people's ancient relationship with the gods and how the gods were revealed to them and the collective knowledge of our folk soul as relates to these gods. It's very important to realize that as a living faith, we are still adding to that corpus. We are still part of that developing saga of the relationship between us and our gods. There's a tendency to place disproportionate amounts of stock in ancient lore at the cost of modern lore and modern experience. And I don't want to discount ancient lore at all. Certainly it's sacred and it's immensely valuable to us. But I just want to say that we have no belief that, Odin rode down on Sleipnir and handed some tablets to some guy in the desert that wrote down his divine commandments. That's not our God. That's not how that works. At some point, this lore was codified and put down by the Gothar and the elders of our ancient ancestors, and they used their collective knowledge. Now, some of that could have come from many things. I don't discount that some of that could have come from visions or from divine inspiration, certainly. But the interpretation of that and the codifying of that was done by the learned men and the priests of the time to encapsulate this wisdom and the stories for us. And we're still part of that today. If we believe that the Gothar of 700 had the authority to codify these stories and to offer insight into the nature of the gods, then certainly our Gothar today have a similar authority to do similar things to add to that continuing story. If our relationship with our gods stopped at some proto-Viking period, that would be a tragedy for all of us and all of our descendants. And I don't believe that's so. I believe we have a living relationship with our gods. It's a long-winded way of saying this. No, I don't think we want to avoid Odin's gaze. But what I do think, perhaps more than any of our other gods, you want to be cautious, and Odin is less likely to suffer fools or suffer the arrogant. Being a patron god, often of kings and of heroes, you have this theme, and you have this theme throughout much of Aryan myth cycle of hubris, of people having excessive pride or, overextending their authority or overextending their station. And those are the moments when very often something comes back to bite them. So I think that any and all of us should be hyper reverent and respectful and cautious when we approach the throne of the All-Father to speak and to ask, certainly to ask of him. And I think this is the case with all of our gods. I don't think we want to over ask. We want to be careful of what we're putting out and what we're asking the gods for. And I know I'm meandering, and I tend to do that when we talk about spiritual things, but I think it's useful when we pray out loud and we hear ourselves. And I think it's a good time to check ourselves and does the high God of Aryan consciousness that breathed the breath of life into our ancestors, that dismantled Ymir, is it really an appropriate thing to ask him to help you on your math test? There's things that are just beneath the gods for you to bother them with. And again, if you're 7 and that's what you ask, then maybe that's, I think the gods also have a certain amount of grace when dealing with, the mentally impaired or the youthful or people in that kind of a place. But in all seriousness, what are you asking of the All-Father? And this goes back to something else. I think it is dangerous to over ask from Odin, but I think it is the height of what one who would be a hero would aspire to do is to get the attention of Odin and to be worthy of Odin looking at you with a nod of, approval, or hopefully, and this is a huge hope, but the idea that you would do something that would make the All-Father proud of you, I can't think of a higher thing to aspire to. And so I would never want somebody to hold back from that. I think that's fundamental. But I think that's part of the relationship with the All-Father. It's not about asking. It needs to be about offering and about displaying before him your merit and your worth, not because you are worthy, but in the hopes that you might be worthy if you did enough. And I think that if you approach with a level of piety, I don't think you want to avoid his gaze. I think again, the idea of Odin looking at you and with pride is everything. Another thing, we think of Odin in this very grim aspect, and I think that when a lot of our lore was written down in the elder times, death was close by, through starvation, through war, through disease, through many things. And I think that it was a grimmer period of time. But if you recall, Odin, he makes his residence in Gladsheim, in the home of gladness. And I think all too often we only focus on the spooky and not the joyous and the celebratory. In his hall, there's feasting and merriment and joy. And I think that's important to notice. There's great dualities with Odin. I think Dr. Stephen Flowers, Edred Thorson said, he described Odin as the Lord of Light and the Drighten of Darkness. And I think that duality really speaks to some of the fundamentals about Victory Father. Danny asks, maybe dumb, it's not dumb at all, what is the perspective on Odin and other gods in terms of omnipresence? Many monotheist religions believe that God can commune anywhere with anyone at any time. What is the AFA's perspective? All right, so I want your thoughts on this first, Svan, because I kind of like to encapsulate and close things up. What go in second? Don't mean to put you on the spot, but where are you at with
Um, I think that when we first talk about like the omnipresence of the fabric of creation and of all things interacting, whether it's the movement of atoms, it's the movement of cosmic, um, you know, matter itself moving around, all the way down to our intentions and our ability to willfully see ourselves in a different place, to even be able to express that we see our consciousness in a different state, in an undisclosed future, is a really powerful thing. And I think that when we talk about that omnipresence, we talk about, and especially amongst in the AFA, is the sacredness of Orlaw or weird, kind of being all pervading. But there's some things to consider when we talk about the stories and we see Odin giving his eye to Mimir and to place his eye in the well of memory, or the well of the past, or the well of that level of the ever expanding sense of weird, whether it's all of the past, or the cosmic sense of all things that had come to pass, was a great need to attain that for purpose. But I think in Asatru, when we consider the divinities, and when we consider the gods, because you did say and other gods, one of their connections to weird, the fact that they are tied into things. I think all humanity is deeply and intrinsically tied to Odin through breath and through a state of consciousness and the ability to communicate our consciousness. However, it lacks dynamicism if it's all pervading and everywhere. And I think that a lot of monotheists don't understand from our perspective of the idea of there needing to be a movement, there needs to be a tying, there needs to be an outer presence, an inner presence that can transition and move, and that it's not all just a sense of relativism, that there isn't, that everything is just either connected or disconnected. This brings about a lot of problems. When people have this concept of relativism, they then see things happening and don't understand why. And if all things are intrinsically tied and omnipresent, then why do these things happen? Again, it could be macro to micro in our perceptions, but we see dynamicism as a form of movement, that there is an ability to move closer in and farther out, and it ties heavily to the gods. We see the gods interacting with the material in ways to maintain order, but we also see them interacting with humanity and the folk through prayer. We see we see them interacting through signs and other things, and sometimes we perceive them as interacting through weird itself, perhaps through like Urther's well, and the idea of the ability to interact with multiple layers of time and all of those massive the movements. But to say omnipresence, I would say no. I don't see the gods as having this over-pervading omnipresence where the willful and the conscious directive is so relative that it's in all things at all times. I think it certainly has the ability to move, the ability to transfer, to go up and down through the veils of separations of reality and plane existence and higher existence, lower existence, primordial existence. Having this ability to move is very, very important in our lore and in our perceptions of the way we give gifts, and looking upwards and looking downwards, or having directions and things like that. These correlate to the ideas of movement, and I think it's really important for us to have that with our structuring of divinity. We don't see it as just simply being relative or simulatory, where it's just you're inside some sort of projection or concept, or these things I think are detrimental to people, where you end up getting this kind of sense of solipsism. And I think that the gods are showing that in their movements, that there isn't this sense that the only thing that is real is my consciousness and everything else is kind of relative and everywhere and all things. And no, instead we are dynamically moving with each other. We're interacting with each other. We're interacting with the gods. We're interacting with our ancestors. There's a sense, even like now with the veil is thin, there's this sense of movement. The idea that if the veil is thin now, then it may be thicker some other time. So there's a sense of presence, and that presence is always preluded with movement. And that, I think, shows that omnipresence is a kind of a detrimental mental state when we talk about the relativism of man and the gods and all things that are interacting with each other. And we can see this in nature. We can see this in cosmic sense, in space and in time. So that's my take on that as far as like omnipresence.
So there's two parts in the way that you ask that question, or at least as I understand it. There's, are the gods present everywhere at every time across existence? And I think Svan covered that really well. The idea of movement, of travel, is time and again spoken about in every single facet of our lore. The gods are traveling to, to this place or to that place or to Jotunheim or whatever they're doing. They're going across the Rainbow Bridge. They're coming back. They're taking a seat of council. They're doing things, and they're moving. That sense of moving is fundamental. The rotational sense is seen throughout our symbols. So no, the gods have to move. But the other thing was omnipresent in the sense that they can hear anyone, any place at any time. And I think, my Latin is not good, so I don't know Latin for hearing. Or I think there's an or root. Anyway, omni hearing, perhaps. And I think that comes to a fundamental. So some of the things are like, are the gods everywhere? Are they in this place or that place? Are fascinating and important to talk about, but to a degree aren't relevant to our human existence. What is relevant is, can I interact with the gods everywhere or at any time? And I have to say the answer to that in some way is yes, but with the caveat that there are times where that connection is more powerful. Svan mentioned, as we go into this fall period of the year, it talks about the veil being thin. We often refer to that in a sense of interacting with our ancestors, but it's the veil between worlds generally. So I think in a spiritual sense of interacting with the gods, this time of year that's easier or better in some way. I think at certain holy tides, the gods take more notice, or your spiritual interaction with them is heightened. I think there are places that are charged with energy that draw more notice. I think that your communication is improved with the gods if you're in front of an altar doing your work, as opposed to walking along the side of the road. I think that at one of our hofs, I think certainly in like a ritual circle, there's power there, and that's a more direct conduit to our gods than, at some other random mundane location. Certainly in our hofs, That is a much more direct way to interact with the gods. And some of that, and I'll mention that in a second, goes to the idea of that omnipresence. I think that the power of a mighty spiritual force, a mighty Haminya, a mighty magical force in a person who's developed that to a high degree has more ability, communicates clearer, communicates louder, communicates more effectively with our gods than someone who has a less developed spiritual gravitas. And I also think that communicating with the gods in ritual where you have numbers of people enhances, how much focus the gods give that. When hundreds of their followers are in one place simultaneously chanting their name and offering them gifts, then I think that's more impactful than just a singular person. But on the issue of omnipresence, one thing that happens when one does ritual, you invite the gods. And if you do it right and it's auspicious and the gods will it to be so, people can notice and feel a presence manifest there. You're calling the gods in, you're inviting them, and sometimes they take you up on that. I think very oftentimes they hear you, but sometimes in a very tangible way, they show up. And I've had that happen several times in pretty meaningful ways to people who are there, of all of a sudden there was a presence in the room. That's also something that's been experienced when we have, when Svan paints the murals of our gods in their hofs. Something happens when that mural is there and when it is completed, that God resides there. There is a presence that exists there. And I don't think that the gods, I don't think Odin hangs out at Odin's Hof rather than in Asgard. But and again, we're trying to find human experience words to relate to concepts that are so far beyond our language and our understanding, it doesn't fit perfectly. But perhaps that's a window, perhaps that's some kind of a conduit of something. But Odin exists in that mural. He also exists other places, but he definitely exists there, and you feel that when you're in that room. If that answers your questions. One of the other things we want to refrain from doing is limiting our gods. Our gods have the might and the power they have, whether we express it or acknowledge it or not, and we never want to project our own limitations upon them and their will and what they want to do. Our gods are gods of will, and they can do what they want unless opposed by some other spiritual forces certainly greater than us. So I think that trying to box in limitations of what our gods are is also a dangerous thing that I would resist the urge to do. Something I wanted to mention, and it, I guess, was more fitting for an earlier question, but I didn't get to it. Something really important about modern lore and about Odin. Odin was the god of our folk that Stephen McNallen first connected with in 1968, and to this day, he is the god that Steve is totally devoted to, and that relationship is now 53 years old. And a lot of things have come from that. The relationship that Steve built with Odin is why we're here. It's why we're having this discussion tonight. It's why y'all are listening. It's why this exists. it was forged out of that. One of the things that I think is true about Steve is that all of modern Asatru is either because of, or I should use the air quotes, all of what is claimed as modern Asatru is either because of Steve McNally or in reaction against Steve McNally. But he is that point of definition that it is defined by. And a lot of that, so much of that is revolving around his relationship with Odin. There's, leftists, communists, people on the other team, the forces of chaos, like to speak ill about Steve McNally every chance that they get. And I listened, and one of his most vocal opponents on a lefty podcast about Steve, through disparaging him and talking about what a terrible guy he is or whatever, they scoffed offhand that, Odin will work with anybody if it gets his mission accomplished. In just that casual barb, this creature admits that the God of Aryan consciousness that shaped Aryan man, that shaped our existence, that is the Father of kings, the Lord of battle, the Lord of victory, has some sort of partnership relationship with Steve McNally, and that he chose to be in that partnership with Steve. I can't imagine a higher praise than that Odin would find you worthy to, in some sense, team up with to accomplish big goals for his people. What high praise from our foes, unknowingly so. And I think that just bears reflecting on. Another thing to talk about personal relationships, and Steve, our personal experiences with Odin, and Steve has told this story a number of times, but I don't think everyone's heard it. I don't think it's a secret, so I'm venturing to tell it. But this really struck me, and I think it was the first time I met Steve back in 2010. He told a story of how one time Odin turned him invisible. And it sounds fanciful, and it's perhaps a fanciful way of putting it. But Steve did a lot of traveling in war-torn portions of Africa that were going through revolution. And I think this happened in Congo or Central African Republic or whatever one of those things that changes names every couple of years, and especially back then did. He was airborne flying into this place when a government change took over. And they were looking for, and just recently an American had gotten shot because his papers didn't match the papers they were looking for at the time. And they pulled him off and blasted him with the AK, as was going on in Africa at the time. And Steve was like, uh-oh, what am I going to do? My my stamp is for the country, my authorization or my visa or my papers are for this country that used to exist, doesn't exist anymore. Uh-oh, it's about to get real. And he's in this line, and soldiers are on the runway, lined everybody up, went through every single person to a man checking papers. And he's like, uh-oh, it's coming. And they meticulously checked everybody. And the way Steve describes it, they checked the man in front of him. And as if they looked straight through him, they went immediately to check the guy behind him. And here's, a middle-aged or younger middle-aged white dude sticks out like a sore thumb on a Congo tarmac. And it's as if they completely looked through him. It's not that they looked at him and chose to look away or nodded him through, or it's as if for a moment he didn't exist and they went right to the guy behind him and nothing else was said of it. And that was, if I'm to understand the story correctly, that was certainly after the Free Assembly days, but that was before the founding of the Asatru Folk Assembly. If that occurrence had not happened that way, and if that miracle had not occurred, then the AFA wouldn't have happened, and we may very well not be here doing what we're doing today. So I think that's an important footnote about the All-Father that needs to be mentioned tonight. Now, for that, Daniel asks, speaking of etymology, are Odin and Oder related? Yes, Daniel, they absolutely are, but I think Svan's going to have a more comprehensive something to say etymologically on that.
Well, when we talk about Odin, and you see the terms like Oder as inspiration, you see it in Otherir, the cauldron, and you also see it mentioned by Hyndla when she speaks to Freya about her searching ever long for Oder. When we see this, and there's accusations in the sagas that are levied at Freya in regards to her linking with Oder, or searching for Oder, and then linking with other gods, and they're, I guess in respects to the story, they can seem to be they are jibes. They're clearly jibes from an antithesis force. But I think it's important to understand that Oder as an inspiration, Oder as a sense of power in beauty, I would say in relation to Freya, the idea of her inspiration, that which drives her forward, that which presents to her inspiration, much like a poet. The question is whether or not Oder is Odin. There doesn't seem to be a direct correlation. Oder is seen as leaving, and then she weeps tears of gold, or the gold of the north being amber, falling to the earth, and there's a great lament and a longing. However, most people do see a correlation that perhaps there is a connectivity between them, and there is references to them being together or intertwining together. Whether we talk about that in perhaps in a physical sense in the stories, but if we're talking about gods and the encapsulation of their coming together, I would say that there's a high likelihood that Oder is perhaps a movement of Odin into Freya's domain or dominion. Perhaps there is an interchange there, but that interchange could not be seen as finite and or forever. And so there is a movement in and a movement out. And so the lament is that movement out. And so there is a regret or a longing for it to remain, but there is not. And so whether that could be in the form of inspiration, whether it could be read as when the Asa and the Vana, when we see cosmic order affecting natural law, there's this interchange between the two, between the Asas and the Vana, or the Aesir and the Vanir. We see this correlation happen over and over again, in which the two sides end up melding through various situations or ideas or cosmic powerful interludes of where they come from, how they affect the universe, the known universe. So if there is this connection and there is this referencing to the idea that Freya learns from Odin, and the barbs kind of denote that it's sexual in nature. And I think it's important for us to know that in these stories, especially towards the later periods, much like the philosophers of Greece, they were really talking about the gods in a mundane sense, or sometimes even in a they were antagonizing and very, very, I would say, unpious. But I take that moment as if there was an interconnection between cosmic order and natural law, and that being the Aesir and the Vanir, then there is this moment where there's this overlapping in which basically the wise and the dynamic of the Vana are meeting the wise and dynamic of the Asa. There is this moment of great inspiration, this moment of deeply powerful transitioning between two gods that has a deep, powerful thing. It's intimate. It's extremely wonderful. And when it then goes away, there would be a lament. So, but it's worth noting as far as structure goes, Other is mentioned and not Odin. And again, there's a lot of things that even right down to the idea that there might be, like for instance, a hero of Freya is Otr, and some people have wondered if there may have been some sort of connection there as well. I don't take it as that Other is a physical man or a worshiper of Freya, but that in essence there is this moment of intercharging between two very dynamic gods in polarization between that which is cosmic and that which is more cyclical. And there's this transfer of knowledge, this unification, and in that power, once it's like a tide, once it recedes, there's a lament because it may never come back. That it wasn't always to be that way. So I take it as that yes, in reference, in short, it is Odin, but also that Odin represents inspiration in a new dynasty of interaction that Freya has with the cosmos. And I think it's deeply poetic that they have this interaction. And I think it's also possible that the gods do have these interactions with each other. It's just clearly the masculine, feminine, and the placement of the stories. It really does have a wonderful poeticism to it. But you see this kind of dynamicism when the gods interact with the Jotuns, when the gods interact with men, whether they're their heroes or the lineage of them or the kings of nations. There's these interactions that happen, and I think in this case it's a reference to the longing of a recession of it. That there's this moment where it's deeply close, deeply there. We see it again too with Odin and Sauga, and their correlation, or with the gods in Aegir and Raun. This movement of them coming to the primordial ocean, the blood of Ymir, and then returning again. So these movements, some of them are very cyclical and constant, and I don't think this case was the case. This case was like a one-time moment of interaction that was going to transfer a deep and profound amount of godly knowledge, and then it was going to re-amplify itself back in its polaric forms. So that's my take on that.
And the etymology, Other and Odin both come from that ecstasy of inspiration.
Yeah.
Brandy says, could you speak to us about the gifts given to us at the creation of Ask and Embla? I know that Svan has a lot of thoughts on this. Svan, enlighten us.
That's actually a great question, because one of the things that's worth noting is in the Nordic, in the Old Norse, it is said that Ond is given by Odin and Other is given by Hjörnir. Again, Other is mentioned as a wit. The triplication of Odin to me is a dynamic part of my theological, understanding of the dynamicism of Odin. And I often refer to the 1R3 and the 3R1, a trinity within itself. And I speak of the three with great importance as much as I do to the one. And I see them as inseparable, and I see them as that the triplication is a symbol of dynamicism and interaction. But it's worth noting, I mean, Ond is the spiritual breath. It could be the prana, if you're talking about in the Eastern context. There's even kind of a scientific force that was referred to when in reference to Ond, talking about the Odic, ODIC, the Odic force, and a lot of ways of conceptualizing that this may have connection to electromagnetic presence and maybe auric presence. And I see a connection there, but what we're deeply talking about is the breath, the animation of the transference between the first step and nothing, which is a huge step. And so when we talk about Usk and Embla, it says they're unrooted and unfated. So that breath is going from not being rooted and not being fated to being rooted and fated into the material. And so I think that is very important in understanding. I think some people see the shaping of the wood in somewhat of a literal sense, and I think that there's obviously deep poetic allegoric connections between wood and humanity or flesh, and there's lots of kennings in reference to this, in which like Odin's oaks are oftentimes referred to, or Odin's ashes are speaking of the ash tree, or speaking of possibly the spears that the menfolk are holding. But there's a lot of references to the idea of the shaping of wood. And I think especially amongst the Norse, the idea of shaping of wood was highly important, especially in shipbuilding and lots of other things. I mean, even to this day, we look at the Nords, as shapers of wood, especially like in references to architecture and things. So there was a deep connection there. So once Odin gives Ond, he takes from unfated and unrooted to rooted and fated. And they have within them that divine spark, that animation of life. And that's deeply powerful. And what makes dynamicism of a god very powerful is the ability to broach between cosmic and material. And you don't see it manifest very often. I think that when we see it in the stories, if it's Thor, the Stormfather, and we see his interaction as energy, in the storm, this physical management, this is powerful, but when he gives Ond, he gives breath and he gives animation, and he then proceeds to move them into the fated state. The ability for humans to understand their animation is first and foremost, I think, important. But then Other is kind of translated as wit or an intellect or an awareness. I often like to conceptualize that along with the idea of the rush of consciousness, there is also a sense that makes us different from animals, in the sense that we can now mentally project ourselves into a state that we don't exist yet. That we don't seem to see that very often amongst, it's hard for us to conceptualize that, or scientists are even looking for it in other animals, for their ability to project themselves into a place that they've never been, or that's the communication that they might be having with, say, an elder animal might be telling them based off of their experience in the past. So now we can project ourselves into a forward movement, into a place that doesn't exist. I can conceptualize myself being somewhere or interacting with something, though I've never been there and I've never interacted with those things. And those things might not even exist when I get there, but I can conceptualize that maybe they are. So that's an interesting thing when we talk about the Other and the sudden rush of consciousness. So I think that's where that fury of Other. And then lastly is Lao. And Hjonur gives Lao, or they. And when you look at the two, differences between, like, say, the Pros Eddas and the Eddas is that the references to Odin, Vili, and Ve. Odin, of course, fury, and or the sudden rush, and Vili being will, the ability to project into, and Ve, holiness, a whole or wholeness, and how those two words deeply correlate with each other. And so holiness and wholeness are one in the form of the body. And I think it's important that when we look at wellness and wholeness, we see when there is dis-ease or when there is something wrong with something, it is not whole. And so we see a paragon of health as being wholeness. So when Hjörnur gives Lao, he gives shape, color, and the wholeness of body, the wellness of being. And so, or in essence, the shape of. And so I've always taken that when we look at Odin, Vili, and Ve being the holy space or the wholeness of space, it's very, very, poignant that the as they are given, that's the order that they are given in. So we see this kind of grand connection to weird, this grand connection to the cosmos, the grand connection of fate, and to be rooted in things. And then we see intellect and body and shape and color added next. The truly powerful dynamic part of Odin being able to take a piece of himself and make from that which is not into something that is, taking a kind of piece of himself is deeply important. And that takes in our stories in the form of the breath. You cannot see it, but it is clearly something that is within you and then comes from without, or comes through your mouth, or as Odin is in the Anglo-Saxon rune poems, like the mouth of the river, that which flows from him. And then suddenly the vessel is filled, it is shaped, it is given intellect, and it is given color and movement in the entirety of it all. So I think that's my take on the three gifts that are given.
There we go. I think that was comprehensively. So Christine asks, what do you suggest for those seeking the wisdom of Odin? I would, steal an answer from Odin, from the Havamal, and say that it's best for man to be middling wise. It's really easy for people new to our faith or younger people or whatever to jump right in and say, I want to be wise like Odin. I don't think people calculate the cost before they want to embark on such an endeavor. You see Odin's, his quest for knowledge and his quests for that are harrowing. They're painful. They're difficult, and they involve great sacrifice. And some of the sacrifices that you can't unknow things. I think that most of us, whether we admit it or not, don't really want to know everything. There's a peace in not looking behind the curtain too much. There's a peace in not gleaming the cube. And I think that most people probably don't really want to have that kind of Odinic wisdom. If we're past that point and we've decided we do want to pay that cost and we do want that burden that comes with great wisdom, then I would suggest, it's hard because as a starting point, I don't know. Wanting to know the mysteries of the universe, there's any number of places you can start, but what I would put special attention towards is things outside of your comfort zone, things that are uncomfortable, things that are outside of your area of expertise, things that perhaps you do need to pay a cost in order to learn or to understand. I think learning things in those realms and from those places, learning things in uncomfortable places is probably a sure path to Odinic wisdom than just focusing on, the stuff you're already very comfortable with. But those are just some thoughts on it. Svan, what are your thoughts on the subject?
I think you're hitting a lot of a truth to it. First and foremost, the middling wise is a good place sometimes to be, because knowing much brings a lot of sorrow or a lot of trouble, a darkness in the mind. Sometimes I think, and sometimes it can apply wisdom, and I think the Odinic sense of wisdom, for a long time, people talked about it in a Faustian sense, the idea of sacrificing a piece of one's self and one's intellect in order to gain a higher understanding. But that higher understanding isn't always necessarily, I think, a bigger or broader understanding of things, but perhaps a honing or an application of that which exists, as opposed to going from a puddle to a river. Instead, maybe looking at it as like from a bucket of water to a pressure washer. The water is still the same, but the means in which it is being transferred is drastically different. So you can find great wisdom in someone who knows perhaps very little about many things, but knows a great deal about one thing. And so I think that the interactions that Odin has with others, other forces, he interacts with them understanding the application in which they project wisdom, the application in which they apply their wisdom, the presence of where it comes from and what they're intending to do with it. I had a friend, and I always remember this, is like truth isn't like some eternal flame. It's a pizza. This is what my friend said. It has to be delivered at the right time. And so the idea is that, like, when people are hungry for things and you give it, it's readily consumed. You place it down at the wrong time and everybody ignores it. And we can see that sometimes when we have this truth, or we have some concept of that, or a lesson that we've learned. I've learned many great lessons in my life. And if I meet somebody, the only thing that really initiates me to even speak upon it is perhaps there's some sort of similarity with that the person I'm talking to is experiencing something very close to the thing that I experienced. So the initiation of knowledge and the interaction of knowledge is, I think, also deeply Odinic. And so it doesn't necessarily always mean the quantity, as it does mean the delivery, the timing, and the application of that wisdom. If I'm struggling with something on my car, and I have a neighbor who's really, really good at being a mechanic, I go to him and I ask him for help, and I learn. I want to learn. I don't just hand him money and say, here, fix this. That's not the way it works. And so I understand the nature of our interaction, and I understand that once I leave this place, I'll have some more knowledge about something. And I try to pay attention to the way he transfers that knowledge. And some people that you go to meet and want knowledge from, they don't transfer it well. That's not necessarily bad. Some people even covet their knowledge and don't want to spread it out and use it as some sort of an application for their furtherance in the world. But so understanding what wisdom is, how it is applied, and where it comes from, and having the perception or the ability to observe those things before the onset is deeply Odinic too. There's more than just the wisdom itself. There's so much more about going in and coming out, and then again reapplying. Sometimes it requires you to the part of the Odinic part of this is the cycles of it, to apply, to go back, to refrain, to be. Sometimes you're scarce, or they're scarce, and then you come back at the right time, and all of a sudden you say the same thing you told them maybe a year ago, but now it has a totally different meaning, or it has so much more of a prominent meaning. It's the same with like books. When we read books and we're digesting a book for the first time, and there's concepts we get and some that we don't, and we gloss over, and then we go back and read it a year later, and all of a sudden it's just hitting things again and again and again. So I would say the cyclical application of understanding wisdom and how it's to be applied is deeply Odinic, and that's one of the mysteries of approaching wisdom, not as a static thing, but a dynamic thing.
What's Odin's purpose in hosting Loki within the halls of Asgard? How would you expound upon the connection between them? If Odin knows the consequences of the relationship, why does he keep the oath? What are your thoughts on this, Svan?
From a material standpoint, when we talk about like Loki and when we talk about the Continentals or things like that, like there's scant record of Loki as like revelation to, or relevation to the people of the continent. It's a stretch in some sense of the word, but clearly it's very, very much there amongst the Nordics. And I would say that Loki is a component, and I would say more so a catalytic component that teaches us many lessons. Myths are perennially, am I saying that right? Perennially truthful. Took me a minute to get that out there. So that the consistency of truth is always applicable in a cycle of movement and motion. So when we see and understand the catalytic moment in which, if we're taking things outside of the circular, the Balder is dead, Balder is amongst the gods, and Balder is returning or has returned. We see things cyclically and compounded, much like a spring. But if we're going to take a section, we're going to pull it out and we're going to look at it to understand the perennial truth of it. See that? It just came out like that. The idea of Loki and Odin, and like say the relation of Balder, knowing the ultimate outcome of this situation, the idea of the seed. We have the Lord of Light, Balder, being slain by the darker half, the dark side of it, of the light of the soul, and guided by a treacherous and foreign hand. Oftentimes we call Loki the kinslayer, because if the oath is, a lot of people think like Odin kept an oath with Loki. Well, Loki kept an oath with Odin, and to kill your own blood brother's son makes you a kinslayer. But do you expect anything less from a treacherous one? So again, are we to be surprised? And then this comes to the idea of whether or not the application of wisdom is that he understood that there needed to be a force of that treachery in order to enact the eternal and perennial truth that the light must recede into the darkness before it can be born again, before it can rise again. Is this solar myth? Yes. Is this perennial wisdom about consciousness and darkness, and about the value of that of the outer guard coming into the inner guard? Yes, it's all there. And how you digest that, I think, can apply in many different ways. If Balder is encapsulated, living, and risen, then so too is Loki enacting, bound, and released. Myth works in a very difficult concept outside of logic. And I think it's important that we understand those truths to apply in those various levels. If we know the stories, if we know that Ragnarok is coming, does it change our our fate? Does it change the things that we do, or do the things that we do ultimately facilitate the event, the inevitable, anyways? And I think in a lot of ways that's the way the dynamic of the stories with Loki and Odin and Balder and Holder are all played out. And so to say that there's some sort of folly in knowing that this is to come, or some of the lessons that are learned throughout the entirety of this whole arc, it all has great wisdom, and I think it's important to understand that encompassing knowledge, and that things do happen that predecess good things. Darkness does come before light rises. So you could take this in many, many different ways. Is it good to honor that which is we know is inevitably going to be a kinslayer, is going to be malicious and degenerative? We see this in the story of the gods, and we should learn from these lessons. We should see what the gods, how they interact with this, and knowing, like with Skadi, looking upon Loki, and she's an outsider and he's an outsider, but she's brought in, she's synthesized. He's not synthesized. He's intertwined, but he's not synthesized, and he never is. And there's many testaments to there being a link, but there's never a full synthesizing of him into the Aesir. And I think that's because he is a catalyst of dynamic force that's outside of the gods and outside of cosmic order, and he initiates a deep reaction that needs to happen. And it's not good. It shouldn't be seen as good. It shouldn't be, oh, well, if Odin knew that it was going to happen, then, he's not really that bad. No, the end result is still the same. Kinslayer, guiding the hand, taking advantage of the situation. These are all, ill things that are laid out in order for us to take that lesson.
So when we get overly literal with the stories of our gods, we miss bigger truths because of a hyper focus on story truths. The narrative in our mythos isn't intended to be literal. It's intended to teach us lessons. It's intended to convey bigger truth to us in a way that's digestible. And also it's Frigga that knows all these things and keeps silent about them, as opposed to Odin knowing all things. He doesn't know every single thing and the outcome of every single thing, or else his wisdom quests wouldn't be of value. Sending out Hugin and Munin wouldn't be necessary. His wisdom of past things from Mimir is immense, but even in a story sense, that's stretching the things that he knows too far. But the theme of chaos being uncontrollable at some point and poisoning order, the theme of people that you let in mistreating your hospitality and betraying you, these themes are extremely important for us to understand and are fundamental to our existence. And I think some of that is what's played out on a grand scale in the particulars of that story. Understanding that, we talked about some of that is part of Odin's knowledge quest. We talked about that earlier. It's best for men to be middling wise. You don't want to know about the betrayal that happens from a friend that you let in. I think that's one of the more tragic things that we realize in our own lives as we grow to maturity, is the full knowledge of betrayal is one of the heaviest burdens to bear. So I think that the tale about the consuming nature of Loki that chaos and letting that chaos in, and the consequences of letting a little bit of chaos in teach us very valuable lessons for the future. And I think that that's a necessary plot element to tell the stories of our gods in a way for people to wrap their heads around. You need villains interacting in order for a story to have an arc that has meaningful depth and lessons to be drawn from it. What or who is the being we call Odin to you? It's a big question, and I'm trying to think of the best way to encapsulate that. Odin is one of our most regal gods. He is a god that inspires and has been fundamental to AFA success for ever. He's the god we dedicated our first Hoff to, and whose Hoff I very often get to worship at and officiate at. He is a god I look to for approval and for guidance as a leader, and seek to understand better, or to make sure that the things I'm doing are in line with things he would approve of, or things he would be proud of, things he would want for his folk and for his AFA. He is one of, I'd say, a driving force in inspiration and in pushing us forward to accomplish and to win and to be victorious. And he is a God that certainly looked over the Asatru Folk Assembly since our very beginning. And that in no way encapsulates all of who Odin is to me, but he's also the God that put his hand on my shoulder at Ostara of 2017. A God that I've engaged in countless ritual to and for and with, and a God that I think that I feel like I've been successful in connecting our folk with Odin and connecting Odin with our folk in ritual. I hope that I have. I feel like that's one of the best connections I've been able to make, and I'm consistently able to make during ritual. Again, like I say, I don't want to assume too much, but I feel that that's a real thing. It's probably the best I've got on that. How does Odin personally show himself to you in your life? Okay, I suppose it's a little bit of a follow-up of the previous question. I answered some of it, but Odin shows himself in my life through blessings that he bestows upon us as the AFA. Sitting at the helm of the AFA, so often people ask, Matt, how are you doing? And the only answer that I know to give is, well, the AFA is doing great. Well, the AFA has got this going on. Well, we're doing this in the AFA. The separation between myself personally and the Asatru Folk Assembly, those lines are irrevocably blurred to where it's one equation. So I see Odin's interaction with me in the way that he interacts with the Asatru Folk Assembly. He interacts with me often because I have the blessing of being able to officiate ritual towards him frequently, and presiding over things at his Hoff very often. So in the feelings and the blessing and the inspiration that occurs during those things, he interacts with me in that way. And he serves as a constant reminder of duty and of need to win and need to achieve as I approach him on my altar. So I think that's a way that he reveals himself in my life. Odin, in different traditions, they describe it differently. And sometimes they even describe different leaders of the Wild Hunt. But the idea of Odin leading ghostly souls through the cold and windy winter woods in search of people who are out when they shouldn't be, and hunting and reaping. Some of that, I think, is a very profound way of expressing that furious energy of Odin, that furious raging through the woods and knocking down anything in his way like a powerful wind. That idea that we talked about at the top of the show of an overwhelming frenzy, or an overwhelming inspiration, an overwhelming ecstatic state. This is a time where Odin rides free through the wilderness and through the woods and through the dark places and through our minds and through our hearts. When Odin is on the ride in his furious glory through the darkness of winter, it is a magical time. But again, as the stories show, it's a time to be very respectful and not nonchalant about going out into the world and letting things happen. It's a time to be very reflective and very careful. But it's also one of the most sacred times of the year. It's when we're closest to our ancestors. It's when we have our highest, times of celebration. It's literally come down to us as the holiday season. But yeah, there's that other that draws closer out in the world and out in the woods.